In November 1973, a group of young adventurers decided to explore the Gruta de Carrizal, a remote cave in Mexico. What started as an exciting adventure soon spiraled into a tragedy that no one could have predicted. 2 boys disappeared into the cave's deadly depths, triggering a frantic search and rescue mission. But caves are unforgiving places. With every hour that passed, the stakes grew higher. Time was running out, and the chances of survival were slipping away. What would rescuers find at the end of their search? Were the boys lost forever in the cave's unforgiving blackness? Because not everyone made it out alive. Welcome to Disastrology, and this is the Gruta de Carrizal disaster. John Everidge had a way about him. Born in 1944, he was the kind of person who couldn't sit still for too long. From an early age, he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. John grew up surrounded by nature and always had a knack for adventure. He was the sort of person who, even as a young boy, wanted to know what was around the next corner, what lay behind the next hill. John had always been an explorer at heart, whether it was hiking through rugged terrain or kayaking down rivers. At some point, John got hooked on the idea of caving. It was not just about walking through the cave. It was about going deeper into the unknown and pushing boundaries where most people wouldn't dare to go. And that's what led him to decide that he would later regret. John had heard all the stories about this cave, but like most people, he didn't believe them. The cave in question, Gruta de Carrizal, is tucked away in the rugged state of Coahuila, Mexico, about 80 miles southwest of Laredo, Texas. It's not just a simple cave. It's part of a massive cave system formed over thousands of years by natural springs that slowly eroded the mineral-rich bedrock. While it started as 3 separate caves, it was eventually proven that they were all connected. The cave's main entrance is part of Cave Number 2, located at the southwest end of a ridge. But getting to certain parts of this cave isn't for everyone. Some areas are so tight that only the thinnest explorers can squeeze through. There's a small, 5-foot-high room that requires some serious caution due to its unstable, potentially dangerous ceiling. One of the cave's most infamous features is a hidden water-filled passage called the siphon. If you're up for an adventure, reaching the siphon is like chasing the holy grail of caving. But to get there, you've got to dive about 10 feet into the water and feel your way along the jagged ceiling. Even then, you're not home free. The interior of the siphon isn't uniform. The water on the right side is around 15 feet deep, while the left side drops over 40 feet. There are tiny air pockets along the ceiling, but they're tricky to find and can't be relied on if something goes wrong. It requires pure luck. Even though it's only about a 15-foot swim horizontally from one side to the other when the water levels are low, it's still a massive leap of faith. This cave is no joke, and John and his group were about to learn that the hard way. John Everidge was always the one in charge when he and his friends went caving. He liked being the first to dive into a cave and lead the way, often putting himself in risky situations that most people would never experience. Back then, a lot of caves in Texas were still unmapped, and that's exactly what attracted John the most. He also heard about some caves in Mexico that hadn't been fully explored, and that's how he found out about Gruta de Carrizal. Now, unmapped caves are dangerous. They come with the risks of falling rocks, sudden floods, and the physical toll of exhaustion, which can lead to serious injury or even death. But one of the rarest and deadliest dangers was getting trapped in a water-filled part of the cave, cut off from the outside world. To John, that danger sounded like a myth. He'd never heard of anyone actually getting stuck, so he didn't give it much thought. In the fall of 1971, John, who was acting as the guide, took a group of friends from Texas to northeast Mexico for a caving trip during Thanksgiving break. 2 of the guys, Chris and Bruce, especially looked up to John. The group came from different cities, Houston, Dallas, and San Angelo, but they all had one thing in common. They were fit, adventurous, and excited. For some of them, it was the first time they'd been away from their parents. They didn't bring any fancy caving or diving gear because John didn't think they'd need it. The plan was simple. If conditions were right, maybe they'd swim in the cave. But other than that, nothing too hard or dangerous. The trip was supposed to be fun, a way to make some memories before heading off to college. The group of Texas boys met in the town of Bustamante on the morning of Thursday, November 25th, 1971. Afterward, they headed to the beautiful Bustamante Canyon and set up camp, excited for the days ahead. The first day was all about exploring on motorbikes and soaking in the scenery. But as the afternoon rolled around, their focus shifted to the Gruta de Carrizal cave, which they planned to visit the next day. Ironically, most of the boys had never even seen a cave before, let alone been inside one. The next morning, they woke up early, ate breakfast, and headed toward the cave, which was only a few miles from their campsite. Once they arrived, they split up into smaller groups to explore. John, of course, took his Houston group into the cave. He showed them around before leading them to the siphon, the cave's most challenging feature. He explained how long it was from one side to the other and mentioned the air-filled chamber on the opposite end. Naturally, the boys were eager to explore. They couldn't wait to see that room and swim through the siphon. But John warned them that it wasn't as easy as it looked. He told them he'd go in first to make sure it was safe, and if he made it, they'd all follow. John tried to get through the siphon 3 times, but each attempt was harder than the last. He kept running into problems and started doubting whether he'd ever make it to the other side. On his final attempt, he went under and didn't come back up. The boys didn't know whether John was in danger or if he had made it through, so one of them ran off to grab a rope. What they didn't realize was that John was actually fine. He had found an air pocket inside the siphon, took a breather, and then pushed through to the chamber on the other side. He reached the tall, 5-foot-high room successfully. But here's where things start to get confusing and scary. John eventually swam back through the siphon and resurfaced, but the other boys didn't seem to notice. Then, John walked further away to find a dry spot where he could change back into his clothes. Not long after, at around 2:30 p.m., Chris Cleveland, one of the boys from Houston, entered the water. The strangest part? He didn't tell anyone that he was going in, whether to find John or just explore the siphon for himself. By the time the boy with the rope returned, Chris had already disappeared into the water. Next, another boy, Bruce Stone, who had no experience with caving or diving, decided to enter the siphon to search for Chris. The group tied a rope around Bruce's waist, with a boy named Phil holding the other end to act as an anchor. Before Bruce went in, they agreed on a simple communication system. 1 tug on the rope meant Bruce was in trouble, and 2 tugs meant he was fine, allowing Phil to let out more rope. The problem? They had reversed the usual signals, and it's unclear if they had ever even used this system before. To make things worse, they forgot to set a time limit for Bruce's rescue attempt. While all this was happening, John had no idea that things were going south. Bruce dove into the siphon, and Phil started to feel what he thought were double tugs on the rope, meaning Bruce was fine. Phil let out 50 feet of rope, which should have been enough to get Bruce through the siphon. But soon after, the rope went slack, and Bruce was nowhere to be seen. This should have been a huge warning sign, but some of the boys chose to leave and explore other parts of the cave. When John found out what had happened, he started to worry, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions right away. Maybe Chris and Bruce had made it through the siphon, just like he had. However, as time passed, this hopeful thought seemed less and less likely. At around 3:45 p.m., John entered the water again and swam through the siphon to the other side. By the time he returned around 4:30 p.m., he told the others that Chris and Bruce couldn't have made it through. He hadn't seen any footprints in the mud on the chamber floor. John considered going back in to check again, but decided against it, knowing it was too dangerous. Instead, he had the boys shine their flashlights over the siphon, hoping the lights would act as a guide for the missing boys back to safety. They kept this up for what felt like hours. By 9 p.m., some of the group headed back to the camp at Bustamante Canyon, but John sent the rest to retrieve them an hour later. When they returned to the cave at about 10:30 p.m., it had been 8 hours since Chris and Bruce had gone missing. Realizing how dire the situation had become, John finally decided it was time to call for help. It was a decision he had dreaded, knowing that this disaster could ruin his reputation as a cave guide. But by this point, it was nearly midnight, and they were in a remote part of Mexico with no payphones in sight. There were no cell phones back in the 1970s. John and a few of the boys drove to the small town of Vadama, hoping to find help. But by the time they arrived, it was 12:30 a.m. The streets were completely deserted. With no payphones in sight, they were running out of options. The chaos only intensified as John and the others scrambled to make sense of what was happening. After finally finding a working payphone in a remote bus station, John tried calling every lifeline he could think of, but one by one, each attempt ended in silence or indifference. Desperation was setting in. His calls to the American consulate and even the U.S. Embassy went unanswered. Finally, he managed to reach Carl Kunath, a fellow cave explorer and rescue expert based in Texas, who promised to do whatever he could to pull together a rescue team. Carl's first call was to another veteran caver, Ray Carroll, who immediately started phoning his own network of experts across the country. But like John, Ray found himself hitting one dead end after another. Hours passed without any real progress, and it was becoming increasingly likely that the missing boys, Chris and Bruce, might already be dead. Yet Carl and Ray pressed on, refusing to give up hope. Eventually, they got in touch with a team of expert divers in St. Louis, led by Conway Christensen, who promised to rally his crew and head down to Mexico as quickly as possible. The plan was to get the St. Louis divers on a military flight, but coordinating with the Air Force turned into a bureaucratic nightmare. They were passed from one base to another, with no one willing to commit to providing the necessary transport. Even after speaking to high-ranking officers in Washington, they were told that military assistance wouldn't be provided unless no commercial flights were available. In a lucky break, Conway managed to secure a free commercial flight for his team, thanks to Eastern Airlines. All they needed now was official confirmation that an emergency was underway. It seemed like things were finally moving in the right direction, but that hope was short-lived. The Laredo team, another group of cave divers who claimed to be experienced in the area, was also heading to the site, throwing everything into confusion. John's rescue mission, which had initially seemed so organized, was now being questioned. A deputy sheriff in Webb County even told them that the Laredo team might render the St. Louis team unnecessary, leading to doubts about whether they should continue. In a devastating twist, a council representative went ahead and canceled the St. Louis team's flight, believing the Laredo divers were more than capable of handling the situation on their own. Carl and Christensen were furious. The cancellation was a blow that could cost lives, but by then, the damage had been done. All they could do now was hope that the Laredo team could pull off the rescue successfully. As for John, he felt utterly helpless. It had been over 26 hours since the boys went missing, and every second counted. Time was running out, and so were their options. Now, all they could do was wait and pray that the rescue would be successful, though deep down, many of them feared it was already too late. The situation was hanging by a thread, and the odds weren't looking good. By Saturday evening, Ash and Worthington were ready for action. They suited up quickly while the rest of the team stood near the entrance, prepared to assist if necessary. After securing a safety line to the bank, the two divers descended into the dark, cold water, beginning their search. They had no trouble navigating the siphon, easily swimming from the entrance to the exit, but there was still no sign of the missing boys. Surprisingly, this gave them a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Chris and Bruce had managed to stay alive, defying the odds for over a day. But then, Ash and Worthington spotted something, a flashlight lying at the bottom of the siphon. A cold chill ran through them. That wasn't a good sign. Worse still, their movements stirred up a mass of sediment, clouding the water and making it impossible to see. The once clear water now looked like muddy soup. With no other choice, the two divers had to pull back, waiting for the murky water to settle before they could resume their search. When they surfaced, they quickly informed the others about the flashlight they found. After waiting for an hour, they dove back into the siphon, determined to check every corner. They made it to an air-filled chamber at the far end, but there was still no trace of the boys. There weren't even tracks in the mud, confirming that Chris and Bruce had likely never made it that far. Unfortunately, the Laredo divers were running critically low on air. Reluctantly, they called it a night. As they left the cave for Sabina's halago to eat, morale was at rock bottom. John felt the crushing weight of responsibility, knowing these boys had vanished on his watch. But everyone held on to a glimmer of hope. The St. Louis crew was supposed to arrive soon, and maybe they could turn the tide. Little did they know, their last chance for a miracle had already slipped through their fingers. The St. Louis crew, still grounded 1,000 miles away, wouldn't be coming. The following morning, Sunday, November 28th, Ash and Worthington prepared for one last dive. They had just enough air to make a quick, final search. By now, 41 hours had passed since the boys first disappeared. This time, though, the water was much clearer, and they could explore the parts of the siphon they missed the day before. But again, nothing. No signs of life. The dread was creeping in, each new shadow around a corner threatening to reveal what they feared most. And then, it happened. Just minutes before 9 a.m., they came face to face with their worst nightmare. Bruce Stone's lifeless body floated against the ceiling, not far from the siphon's entrance. As they moved just a few feet farther, they found Chris Cleveland's body floating eerily still in the water. When Ash and Worthington finally surfaced, their faces said it all. The gut-wrenching reality set in for the others waiting on the bank. This rescue was over. There wouldn't be any emotional reunions or last-minute miracles. The boys were gone. Later that morning, the divers removed the bodies from the siphon and transported them to Candela, where Mexican officials helped John with the grim task of completing the necessary paperwork. He would need these documents to bring Chris and Bruce back home. By the time the ordeal was over, 52 long, heartbreaking hours had passed since the boys disappeared in the Gruta de Carrizal. John, feeling the heavy burden of guilt, took a lot of heat for allowing the boys to swim into the siphon. He claimed that he was on dry land, dressing after his dive, when the boys went in. He said he would have stopped them if they had been closer, but in the end, none of that mattered. The outcome would have been the same, whether the St. Louis team had flown in or not. The boys' fate had already been sealed. Could this have been avoided? Why do we push our limits, even when the risks are so high? This tragedy reminds us that nature can be unforgiving, and no matter how brave we are, sometimes the darkness wins. Would you take that chance? Leave your answers in the comments section below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching. We'll see you guys soon.